This week on the Writers Detective Bureau, justified shootings, FBI arrests, and calling for backup. I'm Adam Richardson, and this is the Writers Detective Bureau. Welcome to episode 69 of the Writers Detective Bureau, the podcast dedicated to helping authors and screenwriters write professional quality, crime-related fiction. This week, I'm proving I've grown beyond 7th grade humor, mostly, and I'm answering your questions about an investigation into a justified shooting, where FBI books their arrestees and calling for backup. But first, I need to thank my Gold Shield patrons Deborah Dunbar from DeborahDunbar.com, CC Jameson from CCJameson.com, Larry Keaton, Vicky Tharp of VickyTharp.com, Chris Ann, Larry Darter, Natalie Borelli of NatalieBorelli.com, and Craig Kingsman of CraigKingsman.com for their support. I also want to send a huge thank you to my Coffee Club patrons. I really do appreciate you. You can find links to all of the writers supporting this episode in the show notes at writersdetective.com/69. To learn about setting up your own Patreon account for your author business or to support the show for as little as $2 per month, visit writersdetective.com/Patreon. Patreon. This week's first question comes from Marco Carocari, who asked this in the Facebook group. During a shootout, my protagonist, who's a regular guy, manages to stop the antagonist by shooting him and saves a detective's life, who's with him at the scene. What happens to my protagonist when the responding team of officers and detectives arrive? The shooting happens on different turf than the detective whose life he saved is assigned to. And also, what is the process of detectives getting info from my protagonist? Interview him there or at the precinct? Process for fingerprints, photos, etc. What else? How long would all of that take, approximately? Since he's a witness, I assume he's free to leave after the interview. The antagonist/perp he shot, as well as the second detective shot by the perp, are in critical condition at a nearby hospital, if that makes a difference. If my protagonist fully cooperates, can he have legal representation there, or would that end any interview if he seeks right to counsel? Thank you for your feedback. There's a lot to answer here, so I'm going to take Marco's questions one at a time. What happens to my protagonist when the responding team of officers and detectives arrive? The arriving officers are going to treat this like every other shooting scene they respond to. They will treat everyone as a potential threat until deemed otherwise, meaning officer safety is going to be the responding officer's primary concern as they arrive. Once they've locked down the scene and deemed it safe, so to speak, they're going to assess and deal with any threats to life they encounter. And by that, I mean medical threat to life. Somebody's about to die out. We just had multiple shootings, right? So that means getting the evidence destroyers, the fire and medics. Kidding, kinda, not really, but getting fire and medics to respond to the scene to treat anyone that's been shot or injured. Realistically, they would have already staged in the area, having been dispatched at approximately the same time as the police officers. So they just wait nearby until it's safe for them to come into the area. From there, the patrol officers will request detectives respond out, most likely, and that will most likely be done through an established notification protocol of some sort. Marco, I know you're writing about LAPD, so I'm assuming this scene is happening outside the city limits of Los Angeles, based on the not being on his turf. So for the sake of answering this, let's just say this happens in the unincorporated area of Los Angeles County, which is the jurisdiction of the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. So assuming we're in sheriff's jurisdiction, the patrol supervisor, likely a sergeant that is overseeing the patrol deputies that initially respond to this call, they would request, or that sergeant would request the sheriff's department's detectives. Depending on the sheriff's department's notification protocol, that could be handled in one of a few ways. The sergeant's on-duty supervisor, most likely a patrol lieutenant, who might be referred to as a watch commander, might be the one to notify the supervisor in detectives. Given that this is Los Angeles, there's a pretty good chance that they have detectives working on a night shift. So it could also be as simple as that patrol sergeant calling the on-duty night detective. Now, that only really happens in very large jurisdictions. The majority of the country doesn't have night detectives. And then another alternative might be to make the request over the radio to dispatch, and then dispatch handles the notification to the watch commander or the detective supervisor or even an on-duty detective directly. I can't speak to the absolute correct answer here, as I don't know what the current protocol or staffing levels are like at the sheriff's department currently, but I'd go with whichever of those options works best for your story. Realistically, it shouldn't be more than a sentence anyway to keep your story moving. No one wants to get bogged down with this stuff. Just, something along the lines of the responding deputies or sergeant requested detectives, and then shortly or not so shortly thereafter, the detectives arrived. Given that this is a potential homicide case, because you have shooting victims headed to the hospital, a CSI team is going to make it to the scene eventually as well. And they may be also going to the hospital to collect any evidence there. And the patrol deputies and or the detectives are going to protect that initial shooting scene, that crime scene in the meantime. And even while CSI is doing their thing, they're still going to be there protecting the scene. So as for your story, the CSI stuff can happen in the background at this point. Just know that it's going on. So the next block that I'll read from Marco's question is, what is the process of detectives getting info from my protagonist? Interview him there at the precinct, interview him there or at the precinct, process for fingerprints, photos, etc. What else? It's going to be natural for the responding patrol deputies to ask what happened as they try to get a handle on what occurred. So they're also trying to figure out whether there are any outstanding suspects or outstanding weapons and that kind of thing. You have to remember, they don't know anything other than they have 2 people shot at this point. So the initial statements made by your protagonist are most likely going to be audio recorded and very likely captured on body-worn cameras or on a patrol car camera as well if your story is set in current time. Now, that said, your protagonist is in for a very long night because the real interview is going to happen at the station. The sheriff's detectives are also going to try to interview the other 2 as to what happened as well. Oh, and when they figure out that one of their shooting victims is an LAPD detective, oh man, stand by, because LAPD will, without a doubt, insert themselves into the case, even though it's outside their city limits. And they're going to do so ASAP. When one of their own gets shot, they are not going to sit around and wait for a report from another agency. I know department rivalries are real, and Hollywood loves to make the most of those conflicts. But when cops get shot, we are all on one team. So you can bet that it won't just be the sheriff's detective that happened to be working that night handling this case. Bosses are going to be woken up at both agencies to figure out how all of this is going to play out. Either during or just after the protagonist's interview, they will get his fingerprints. They will swab for GSR, that's gunshot residue, which I talked about back in episode 12, if you want to learn more about that. And they will probably take his clothes as evidence, too. They'll likely photograph him as well, and that's to photo document what he looked like after the incident, whether he had any abrasions or signs of a struggle, his hands, fingers, head, his hair, his ears, basically a head-to-toe photo shoot. Oh, and one important vocabulary thing I meant to mention, and it goes hand in hand with last week's episode on cop slang. When you're writing about real police agencies like the LAPD or LA Sheriff, knowing what the cops in your story call things in real life can be a make or break thing for some readers. I don't mean to call you out on this, Marco, and I know how much you research this stuff, so I seriously doubt it would actually end up in your story. But in this section of the question, you said, interview him there or at the precinct. Precinct is a very East Coast law enforcement term. In California, it is not a precinct. The station, and I say that with air quotes, the station is the most common catch-all term that we use. If it's a specific station, they may just refer to it by the station's number or by the name of the station. LAPD's headquarters was, for the longest time, Parker Center. And then a few years ago, they built a beautiful new headquarters, and they refer to it as PAB, which is Police Administration Building. So it's just not going to be a precinct here on the West Coast. But if we said, I'm sure there's an equal thing on the East Coast that if we referred to their building in NYPD or in Boston, they would probably have our heads for having that wrong as well. Okay, detectives, I should also mention, they may refer to it as the office or the bureau or something like that. And when they say that, even though they may be talking about that same station, they're really meaning the detective office or the detective bureau within that station, which is likely where the interview room that they plan to use is located. So all that to say, pay attention to what terms are or are not used, and at the very least, don't call it a precinct in California. The next part was, how long would all of that take, approximately? Since he's a witness, I assume he's free to leave after the interview. Like I said before, it's going to be a very long night of questions and photos and evidence collection for your protagonist. And technically, he isn't just a witness. He might eventually be responsible for a homicide, depending on how well your antagonist is doing at the hospital. Even though all signs will quickly, hopefully, point toward our protagonist being viewed as the good guy in this, the investigation still needs to show that the shooting was a justifiable use of force, as opposed to an attempted murder. So that the evidence is going to be what leads the detectives that way. Going into it, they're going to have an open mind, and they're going to try to figure out what happened, just like any other investigation. Which leads us to the last part of Marco's question. If my protagonist fully cooperates, can he have legal representation there, or would that end any interview if he seeks right to counsel? Yes, he can. It's very possible the detectives will view this as a consciousness of guilt. I mean, they can't legally, but that's usually a pretty good sign if a guy lawyers up. But hey, you know what? If I was in this position, I would do exactly the same thing. Seeking counsel is an automatic end to the questioning from the detective's perspective. But your protagonist can elect to continue answering questions once the attorney arrives. This would actually be a pretty good indicator to the detectives that the protagonist really is above board, albeit a little concerned about his predicament. But whether he's free to go or not is really going to be up to the detective team and what they think they have. Admitting that you shot someone to protect another and being open and honest about it, assuming the investigation seems to corroborate the story, might lead to being allowed to leave. But at the same time, having a person admit to shooting another human being isn't exactly going to be a snap decision on the detective's part when it comes to letting them go. Again, knowing how many bosses are going to be involved since you have an off-duty LAPD detective being shot, let's just say there's going to be a lot of discussion behind closed doors before your protagonist goes home. Keep in mind, you can ramp up or cool down your protagonist's situation pretty easily, especially if the injured detective is able to give a statement that corroborates your protagonist's assertion of what happened and explains what role the antagonist had in it as well. Hey, I hope this helps Marco, and you can check out Marco's work at marcocarocari.com, and the link to his website will be in the show notes. Author Allison Baxter asks, if you're arrested by the FBI, I assume they have a lockup at their office. Is it usually a cell? Then, you're supposed to get a hearing with a judge, right? Do they work on the weekends, or do you have to wait until Monday? And finally, can you have visitors, a spouse? Thanks. Allie actually asked this in the Facebook group, and this was my response. FBI agents will make arrests for federal crimes, and the suspects are booked at a federal detention center, most often co-located at a federal court. The detention facilities are run by the U.S. Marshals Service. Just as a side note, I have a correction to make to my statement there. And finally, to see an example, just Google Metropolitan Detention Center, Los Angeles. Most of the Fed arrests I've been involved in required the suspects be driven by the FBI to MDC, even if there was a 3-hour drive. And local booking usually happens if it's an after-hours arrest. So that was the end of my answer in Facebook. So the first thing is I need to correct what I said about these facilities being run by the U.S. Marshals. These detention facilities are run by the Federal Bureau of Prisons, but the U.S. Marshals Service are the ones that run the inmates between the detention facility and the courthouse because they provide the security for the courthouse. As I said before, the two are usually co-located. So, for instance, the MDC in Los Angeles is located at 535 North Alameda Street, and the Edward R. Royal Federal Building and U.S. Courthouse is located at 255 East Temple Street, which is actually not the only U.S. courthouse in Los Angeles. But if you pull it up on Google Earth, you will see the two buildings actually stand less than 100 feet apart. And underground, the two buildings are connected so the U.S. Marshals can keep the inmates in a secured area the entire time. Oh, and I've been to at least 6 FBI offices that I can think of, at least off the top of my head. It may very easily be more than that, but I have never seen a lockup facility inside an FBI office. Now, there may be an FBI office inside of a federal building that's physically attached to a detention facility. That's pretty common, similar to that courthouse to MDC setup I just mentioned. But I've never seen one inside the FBI office. I could be wrong, but just in my own personal experience, I've never seen any kind of cell or lockup in an FBI office. Depending on where you live in the country, it may seem like there aren't any federal courthouses or detention facilities, federal detention facilities near you. But let me explain how federal law enforcement takes its cue from the courts when it comes to divvying up AORs. Now, AOR is Fed slang for areas of responsibility. At the local level, we just say jurisdiction. But when you're the FBI and the entire country is your jurisdiction, the office you're assigned to has geographic boundaries for their area of responsibility. I don't know that area of responsibility is the actual formal name for it, but it's certainly the vernacular that the agents and analysts I've worked with all use. Obviously, the entire United States falls under federal law, and federal law violations are heard in U.S. district courts, which are federal trial courts, where the prosecutor is the U.S. Attorney's Office. We have 94 of these district courts, and there's at least one district court in every state, as well as in the District of Columbia and the 4 territories like Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, obviously not the British Virgin Islands, Guam, and Northern Mariana Islands. In California, we have quite a few district courts, and they're broken down by region. For instance, the United States District Court Central District of California covers 7 counties, including Los Angeles. That 7-county central district for the U.S. District Court system matches the 7 counties the United States Attorney's Office Central District of California handles for federal prosecutions, which also matches the 7-county AOR for the FBI's Los Angeles field office. So the boundaries for the court, the U.S. Attorney, and the FBI field offices are all the same. And there's a federal detention center near the district courthouse in each one, at least as far as I'm aware. So when it comes to the FBI, a field office is like a big regional headquarters. But then throughout the AOR, which for the FBI's Los Angeles field office are 7 really large counties, the FBI will have a bunch of smaller satellite offices, and those are called resident agencies, or as we call them, RAs. So those RAs are spread out across the AOR. So I hope that's not too much federal acronyms, and I hope that makes sense. As for booking inmates into a county jail, that can certainly happen. Some judicial districts or field office AORs are gigantic when it comes to actual square mileage. So it is entirely possible that federal arrestees may be held in a county jail at some point after the initial arrest, but it's usually just a part of their journey, kind of like an after-hours hotel for people under arrest, as they make their way into formal federal custody at a federal detention center. And this happens pretty quickly, because that, as far as getting them from out of a local jail and into federal custody, formal federal custody, because the clock has started when it comes to arraignment. And that clock runs on court time. So yes, they may wait until Monday to get booked into the federal detention center, but there really is an important clock ticking because it is directly tied to all of our Sixth Amendment right to a speedy trial. So here's your homework for the week. Figure out which federal district court you live in. And the name of it is not going to be the same as the circuit court number for the U.S. Court of Appeals. All right, so enjoy the research rabbit hole with that one. Thanks so much for the question, Allison, and you can find her work at AllisonBaxterAuthor.com. Stephanie Burnham writes, in television and movie dramas, police seem to want to skip doing certain things that might require paperwork. Is calling for backup one of those things? I want my scene to appear realistic. In my scene, 2 police officers are ordered to investigate a noise complaint and realized when they get there, a strange phenomenon is happening. They are over their heads. Would the lead officer say, let's skip calling for backup because of the paperwork involved? This is a great question, Stephanie. The answer is no. There's no paperwork. You can ask for backup just because of JDLR, which stands for just don't look right. When the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, that's your body telling you something. It's your survival instinct. Just like when you need food, you feel hungry. When you need water, you feel thirsty. Your body always tells you when there's something that's potentially life-threatening going on. And most of us listen to every one of those things but the feeling of fear, because that's what it is. And any streetwise cop will listen to that feeling. Not asking for backup gets cops killed. But I'm betting, knowing smart, crafty authors like I do, like you, Stephanie, you're probably looking for a plausible reason for your cops not to call for backup, and I may have a solution for you. First of all, when an officer asks for backup, it usually means one more officer. We always want to outnumber our opposition. So if I pull a car over with one person in it and I get that JDLR, just don't look right feeling, then 2-on-1 feels doable. So with 2 officers working together on this call in your scenario already, they probably feel like they already have backup in each other. So that's one scenario. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, it's very possible that this agency suffers from an atmosphere of that bullshit, pardon my French, tough guy, one riot, one ranger, kind of thinking where you better not call for backup unless the fight is on. I can only think of one agency in California where I've encountered that kind of thinking. I don't know if that agency is still the case, and I'm not going to mention it. But as I said, that kind of atmosphere, that kind of thinking is how cops get killed. But if it's a rural police department or a sheriff's department where it's going to be a half an hour for that backup to arrive, that could be another reason for them not to call for backup, because let's just call it what it is. It's peer pressure. So peer pressure to be tough and to handle your calls and not constantly need help from other officers or deputies. It's unsafe and it's ignorant. And if you work in a violent area, you'll know just how dumb this kind of thing is. But creating a peer pressure situation might be another motivation for your officers not to ask for backup. I hope this helps, Stephanie. Thank you so much for listening this week. This show is powered by your questions. Send them to me by going to writersdetective.com/podcast. Thanks again for listening. Have a great week and write well. Welcome to episode 69.
If you guys are really us, what number are we thinking of? 69, dudes!